The Iowa Hawkeyes, a fascinating team within the context of the Big Ten. I say that because they won their last 6 games. They start 0-2, but it's a 4-point loss to Purdue and then a 21-20 loss to Northwestern. And that loss to Northwestern ended up being what kept Iowa from being able to play for a Big Ten title. Now, I don't know if Iowa would have made any difference with the Ohio State, and especially the way that Trey Sermon was running the ball behind that offensive line in that Big Ten championship game. But I think the point remains that the Hawkeyes feel good about the way they finished the season. They get the win against Wisconsin. They've got the win against Penn State. And so we look at the Hawkeyes as though they've got a little bit of juice, a little bit of reasons to hang on to, like, hey, let's go make a run at the Big Ten West title. Now, some new faces, particularly because we're losing Chauncey Golston. We're losing Davion Nixon. I mean, we're losing elite defensive linemen. Zach Van Valkenburg is going to be a super senior, so we'll have him back. But all of those other positions on the defensive line are up for grabs. I think the competition along the defensive line is so important because that defensive line was so key to a lot of Iowa's success. We always talk about the quarterbacks. Spencer Petras had a good finish to the season, started to come on a little bit late, but I don't know if I've got him marked as I've got him marked as an important player, but I don't know if I've got him marked as a player that I have very high expectations for. And some of that might be just even within the context of the offense, which also is going to be replacing about half of its starters. So defensively, on the back end of the defense, they do have some returning players and key contributors. Up front, a lot of people need to step up to join Van Valkenburg if they're going to continue to be an Iowa defense that gets a lot of sacks, gets a lot of tackles for loss. But it is a year that I think that you look at Iowa and you have to consider them right there in the mix for a Big Ten West title. So is it defensive line? Is it the quarterback position? It's the offense. What's really got y'all's attention when it comes to the Hawkeyes?
I think everything you just mentioned is important. I think the defensive line is definitely going to be an area of interest to follow. But at the same time, I do have some confidence there just because we've seen Iowa replace their defensive linemen before and bring in guys that maybe you didn't hear of that weren't highly rated recruits, and they develop them. But of course, they've had some changes to their strength and conditioning program in the last year, which we'll see how that impacts them going forward. But one of the things to me, I think Spencer Petras played well. I think he looked like an Iowa quarterback, but I think when I watched him play, he looked like every other Iowa quarterback I've seen. But I saw flashes of maybe somebody like a little bit more than that, like not just a game manager type. And I wonder if in his first year as the starter, if not having the spring practice and all that kind of no non-conference games, how that really impacted him. But one thing that kind of stood out to me last year when I was watching Iowa, and I'm grading them on a curve because I'm grading them based on previous Iowa teams, is I thought that offensive line last year for an Iowa offensive line was pretty mediocre. Like, it wasn't, I don't think it was a bad offensive line. I think it was probably still one of the top half of the Big Ten, and it was probably still about, the top half of the country. It's just from what I'm typically used to seeing from an Iowa offensive line, that's just typically sending, like this had first round draft picks in recent years and is continuously sending guys to the NFL. And I think Alaric Jackson will probably be an NFL draft pick this year too from that line. But it just overall, the unit to me did not seem as strong. I think it really hurt them in their run game. I think that really hurt their offense. They weren't really able to get a ton of push, I thought, up front most of the time. And I think that's going to be a key thing too, because I feel like just the way that Iowa plays, if their offensive line isn't winning the battle most of the time and getting push off the ball in the run game and, pass protection, of course. But I just think if they're not out physicaling their opponent, and at times last year, I thought they were being out physicaled, it's hard for Iowa to win the way Iowa intends to play. So for me, that's going to be something, an area of interest for me watching the Hawkeyes this spring. If I'm paying attention to practice, I want to see that offensive line. We've got some young, inexperienced guys on the defensive line. I want to see my OL knocking those dudes on their ass.
I think there's some numbers to really support what Tom's saying here, too. I was digging on it as you said that. I mean, their top rusher, Tyler Goodson, was stuffed 22% of the time.
Yeah.
That's not Iowa, right? I'm a little bit concerned about Spencer Petras, to be honest. And the main thing I'm concerned about is the big misses, right? And I don't love some of the Sports Info Solution stats we get. Like, I don't know who's doing the grading, but I think they're generally probably better than not, right? 68% catchable balls. think like flip that. That's 32% uncatchable balls. That's a really high rate, man. Like that's just me a guy that has some really bad misses. He's got to get it somewhere in the vicinity. And especially this year, because I have major concerns about what the Hawkeyes lose at the receiver position, right? They lose Smith Marset, they lose Brandon Smith. Those guys had 48 catches. The rest of their receivers combined had 32, 33. So when they're losing more than half of their catches, a really good chunk of their yards, that's concerning about where this passing offense is going. That's kind of my main thing here.
I love what Tom said about the quarterbacks. Like he does. Spencer Petras does just look like an Iowa quarterback. And it's so, but like, I think that can be a knock, but it could also be a good thing. Like they've won with very Big Ten kind of style quarterbacks. They very clearly have an identity of what they want to be. I thought this year that it was a rough offseason for Iowa, right? There were all the allegations against Kirk Ferentz and his staff. Chris Doyle, gets fired. They have, they oust him. But I do think one thing that I think would be concerning is Chris Doyle, love him or hate him or, whatever he did was awful, got a lot of guys to peak performance, and that's the strength coach, I think, is one of the most underrated positions on college football coaching staffs. I mean, go ask Urban Meyer about what he thinks about the coaching, the strength and conditioning coach. I mean, you're talking about players at the most critical time of their lives. When you go to college, that's when you're maturing and you can develop players into NFL type talents. And Iowa has been a place that consistently churned out really, really good college offensive linemen, in some cases, NFL offensive linemen. So I do wonder, like, the job of replacing Chris Doyle, how that's going, and if that was a reason why the offensive line wasn't as good. Now, in one season, probably not enough time for that drop off to occur, maybe just youth and experience. But I was actually really impressed with Iowa's job, because after 0-2, you're thinking this season could go one of two different ways. And I actually thought it was going to go completely downhill. But then for them to kind of keep continuing back and to win out, I thought was really impressive. So I think the season will be interesting. I think the identity thing is great because you know what you are, you know what you want to be. But I still think it's Wisconsin here. Like, I still think with the talent returning, and I think Iowa's always going to be right in the mix, and they'll probably be there again. But I just don't think this is their year.